Behind the shadowed doorway, the early morning sunlight filtered through the small windows of the Nguyen family's modest two-story home in a quiet suburb outside Seattle. The house, though unremarkable from the street, always housed an abundance of warmth, a haven for laughter at mealtimes, and the aroma of simmering pho on cold afternoons. But within those familiar walls, there had always been a sense of striving, an undercurrent of dreams stitched together by sacrifice and hope. Jane Nguyen, the only daughter, woke each day to the murmurs of her parents speaking softly in the kitchen. Her father, Daniel, a first-generation immigrant from Vietnam, had poured his entire soul into building a small textile business from scratch. Hard work ran in his veins. Even when exhaustion etched lines deeper across his brow, he would greet Jane with a gentle smile and a bowl of rice. Her mother, Linda, balanced work at a local market with managing the home and tending to Jane's studies, always reminding her, with both pride and worry, how much they had given up so she could have a better life. Though American by birth, Jane always felt the duality of her world. At high school, she was the quiet student, diligent, almost invisible, careful not to draw attention to her mismatched lunchbox or the accent that slipped into her English at home. Yet, she wore her parents' hardships like a badge. Every evening, after finishing her homework, Jane would help her father count the day's receipts at the kitchen table, learning the maze of numbers and invoices with meticulous care. She watched, often in silence, how her father's optimism buffered the disappointment of another late payment or a canceled order. Yet as their business slowly grew, so did the family's hopes. There were signs: a small used car to replace the aging minivan, tuition saved for a possible college future, and even some timid plans for a long-awaited trip back to Vietnam. Jane's father began to speak more of the American dream, recalling stories of his own youth, how he had crossed the Pacific with nothing but courage, promising himself he would someday buy a house where his daughter would never know hunger. Despite their modest success, the shadow of uncertainty never left. In the quiet moments, over clinking chopsticks or folding laundry, Jane sometimes sensed an anxious flicker in her parents' eyes. There were hints of past disappointments, vague references to betrayals from years before, but Daniel always shielded her from the details. To Jane, her father was unbreakable, and her family, despite its worries, was whole. One chilly evening, Jane found herself lingering by the front window, watching the yellow porch light shimmer against the encroaching darkness. She was thinking about her English essay, about college applications, and about the burden she sometimes felt pressing on her young shoulders. In the warmth and safety of their home, she believed nothing truly bad could happen to them. They had already endured more than most. She never imagined their sanctuary could ever be pierced by forces from within, the very blood that ran through their family veins. As night crept over the neighborhood, Jane shut the curtains, unaware that her family's story was on the cusp of an unforeseen turn. The darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if foreshadowing the long shadows that were about to stretch across their home and hearts. The bitterness of collapse. The first sign that something was wrong came in small, almost invisible ways. The light-hearted mood around the Nguyen family's kitchen table began to dull. Daniel, usually the first to crack a joke or share good news from the business, stared longer at his morning coffee. Linda started counting every dollar bill more carefully, sometimes glancing toward Jane as though she wanted to say something, but the words never quite left her lips. It wasn't long before worry permeated every part of their lives. Jane overheard whispered conversations late at night as she passed her parents' bedroom door. She caught fragments, words like loan, mortgage, and deadline. The business's modest prosperity had hinged on a contract with a large supplier. It was supposed to be their breakthrough, the payoff for years of sacrifice. Now her father's phone calls grew tense, and each ring seemed to bring more anxiety than hope. Then, the crisis struck with full force. One afternoon, a letter arrived, a terse, formal document from the bank. The family's business loan was being called in. The prized contract, once so promising, had proven to be a ruse. Shipments that should have been delivered had never arrived, and payment that was supposed to clear their debts never materialized. The trusted business partner, who vouched for everything, had disappeared, unreachable by phone or email. Daniel fought desperately to contain the fallout. He spent sleepless nights on the phone, pleading with lenders and promising to make good on obligations. But the numbers simply didn't add up. The business accounts, once their symbol of hard-earned progress, were now a string of red negatives. Jane watched her father age years in the span of days. The coming weeks were a relentless assault of losses. Workers at the shop had to be laid off, their apologies falling on the devastated faces of men and women who had become like family over the years. One by one, the machines in their textile factory went silent as suppliers refused to deliver new materials on credit. What remained of their inventory was sold at a fraction of its worth, just to keep the lights on a little longer. At home, the sense of security unraveled. Linda, under constant stress, grew ill and frail. She tried to put on a brave face, but her persistent cough and drawn look spoke volumes. Jane started taking over more of the household chores, her worry mounting as medical bills joined the pile of unpaid invoices. The arguments grew sharper. Daniel, once optimistic, now sat for hours dejected and silent. He blamed himself for everything, for trusting the wrong people, for not seeing the signs, for risking his family's future. Sometimes, in private, Jane caught her father's shoulders shaking, his breaths broken by tearless sobs. Each day, the atmosphere at home grew heavier, the space between family members filled with disappointment and unspoken fear. Jane, sensing her parents' despair, tried to remain steady. She attended school as usual, burying her anxiety beneath the ritual of classes and textbooks, but the cloud hanging over her home was never far behind. Her friends wondered why she became quieter, why she stopped going to after-school activities or buying lunch at the canteen. The low point came when the letter from the bank was followed by a notice of repossession. The family's business property, the factory Daniel had built from nothing, was to be seized within weeks unless the debts could be repaid. A home visit from a bank representative sealed the reality. The house, too, was at risk if things didn't change. There were no handouts, no more extensions, just cold deadlines. Despite the turmoil, Jane refused to give in to despair. She quietly resolved to become her family's support, even as exhaustion settled in her bones. Together, they gathered at the dinner table, not to celebrate, but to grieve. Yet underneath the shared silence, Jane's determination began to harden. She knew the collapse was not a force of nature. It had been orchestrated. Someone had set her family up to fail. That lingering suspicion, unspoken but insistent, would become the seed of something new. But as Chapter 2 closes, the Nguyen's world is unrecognizable. The safety, the stability, the trust that once held them together has shattered, leaving only the raw ache of loss and the first glimmer of resolve. The harsh truth: Jane's life settled into a strained, numb routine after the collapse. Each day blurred into the next, a fog of chores, worry, and quietly growing resentment at the injustice dealt to her family. The air at home, once filled with gentle banter or the sizzle of a home-cooked meal, now felt thick and oppressive. Even the light seemed dimmer. as if the world itself mourned their loss. But Jane was never the type to surrender. Beneath her reserved exterior welled a persistent, simmering determination. Pain can breed helplessness or resolve, and for Jane, even in her lowest moments, resolve was taking root. It started almost by accident. One day, as she organized a heap of overdue bills and legal correspondence that had accumulated on the kitchen table, Jane's eye caught on a letter bearing the crest of their family business. It wasn't a bill or a creditor's notification. Its tone was odd, almost cordial, and it was addressed specifically to her father. The letter referenced a transaction, one Jane had never heard her father mention, concerning the transfer of significant business assets. Confused, she leafed through more papers, piecing together a trail of signatures, notarizations, and, strangely, emails forwarded from an unfamiliar address. Uneasiness twisted in Jane's stomach.
I am telling the truth.
She remembered her father's exhausted face, his refusal to speak too openly about what had gone so wrong. Why were there documents mentioning a Thomas Nguyen, her uncle, her father's younger brother, whom she'd last seen at a tense, uncomfortable family holiday dinner? Driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Jane began her own private investigation. After school, she pored over old business files, emailing herself scanned copies of anything suspicious. Late into the night, light from her laptop reflected in her tired eyes as she searched official state records, business registration documents, and property deeds. What she found made her heart pound with anger and disbelief. Piece by piece, Jane built a narrative that was almost too painful to believe. In the critical months before the collapse, Thomas had systematically maneuvered his way into the business's financial infrastructure. He had gained control of signing authority on key accounts, her father's trusting nature and respect for family making it easy for Thomas to help with paperwork. Under the guise of a proposed partnership expansion, Thomas had used forged signatures, backdated agreements, and shell companies to siphon assets, including the very factory that was now repossessed by the bank. The cruelest detail that Jane uncovered was the timing of Thomas's actions. Correspondence showed that her uncle set his trap at the moment their family was most vulnerable, all smiles and false promises as he moved in for the kill. Not only had Thomas betrayed his own brother, he had done so calculatingly, leaving Daniel to face the creditors, the shame, and the wreckage of a reputation built over decades. Jane's first reaction was overwhelming disbelief. No one in her family could be capable of such betrayal, least of all her father's only brother. Confronted by the stark evidence, emails, notarized documents, bank statements, denial gave way to white-hot fury. She shook with anger, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as she realized that everything her parents had endured was the result of deliberate, familial exploitation. But the truth, as shattering as it was, also lit a spark within Jane. After the initial storm of grief, another stronger emotion began to take hold: a need for justice. She realized the laws that should have protected her family had been manipulated by someone who understood how to take advantage of trust, language barriers, and Daniel's fear of legal confrontation. Swallowing her fear and confusion, Jane made a silent vow as midnight ticked past. She would not let her family's suffering go unanswered. The pain Thomas caused would not be swept under the rug of family business. Jane decided that if the law was the only way to right this wrong, she would learn it herself, no matter how long it took or how hard the road ahead might be. That night, Jane didn't sleep. As her parents finally drifted off together in their room, worn out by grief and exhaustion, Jane's laptop glowed steady and resolute on her desk. She began her first tentative searches.
Oh, goodness.
How to report financial fraud, legal consequences of business theft, What evidence is needed in court? Though overwhelmed by legal jargon and fear of what might come next, she felt for the first time in months a fragile sense of purpose. The harsh truth had shattered Jane's remaining innocence, but in its wake emerged a new, determined Jane. She was still her parents' daughter, shaped by sacrifice and love, but now she was also driven by the need for justice. In facing the reality of her uncle's betrayal, Jane took her first step beyond helplessness, setting in motion the transformation of her pain into power, set on changing her fate. For weeks after Jane unearthed the truth, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The shock was raw, but her fury, righteous and personal, gave her a focus she had never felt before. The shape of her life, once guided quietly by her parents' expectations, was now shifting under the weight of a new purpose that she could neither ignore nor postpone. Yet, deciding to transform her life was much easier than actually doing it. The Nguyen family, once a unit bound tightly by shared dreams, had become a constellation of individual pains and silent burdens. Jane saw the toll every day, the way her mother's eyes flickered with worry, the hollowness in her father's once steady hands. She also recognized another, subtler force: fear. There was fear of starting over, fear of community judgment, and, above all, fear of confronting their own family in a court of law. At first, Jane tried to hide her resolve, keeping her research and ambitions private as she pored over legal blogs, case studies, and stories of first-generation Americans who had fought systems stacked against them. She scribbled down words she couldn't pronounce in class, posting sticky notes all over her mirror: litigation, deposition, restitution. She practiced speaking them aloud in the quiet before dawn, making her voice steady and strong. College applications had already been looming, yet Jane now saw them as a ticket to something more than just a degree. They were her way out and her way forward. She rewrote her essays, framing her family's struggles and her emerging sense of justice as the central narrative. The story was no longer just about hard work or gratitude. It was about refusal to be a victim, about the transformative power of truth. Still, her new ambition faced hurdles that went far beyond the usual anxieties about SAT scores or recommendation letters. Her parents, clinging to a hope that things would return to normal, resisted her vision at every step. "You're smart," her mother would say, folding laundry with trembling hands. "You could be a doctor, a pharmacist, an engineer. Why make life harder by tangling with the law? Lawyers are for rich people. Lawyers make enemies." Her father was even less supportive, his disappointment accentuated by shame. The disgrace of family betrayal, especially from his own brother, had left Daniel afraid of scandal, afraid of what the Vietnamese community would whisper about them at market or temple. "The past is the past," he muttered, avoiding Jane's eyes at dinner. "Don't stir up trouble. It won't bring back what we lost." But Jane was no longer a child who could be dissuaded by others' fears. Politeness and patient silence had stolen too much from her family already. She would not let them be defined by loss or submission. Bit by bit, she tested her arguments. That law was not just for the well-off, that their story deserved to be heard, that justice could be for people like them too. It was a long, lonely battle. Letters arrived from universities, each thin envelope sparking fresh hope or disappointment. Some schools dismissed her application, her grades respectable but not dazzling in the chaos after the collapse. Others, moved by her story and her determination, offered her a chance: a spot to study pre-law, a modest scholarship, the promise of something more. The day her acceptance letter from the University of Washington arrived, Jane held it with trembling hands at the kitchen table. She watched her mother's face crumple into tears, relief, pride, and the nagging ache of fear all swirling together. Her father looked away, his jaw tight, but his hand found Jane's shoulder in a rare moment of wordless support. The next months flew by in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Jane took a part-time job shelving books at the public library, saving every dollar to help cover the gap in tuition. She spent her nights prepping for the rigors of undergraduate coursework, reading everything she could find on American civic history and the basics of contract law. Arriving on campus, she felt suddenly small, her confidence ebbing as she navigated a world of polished lecture halls and crowds of students whose parents were doctors, executives, or professors. In her first law seminar, Jane fought to keep her voice steady as she argued her case on a fictional tort lawsuit. Her accent slipped, her hands shook, and she heard snickers from the back row. But when she outlined her reasoning, careful, clear, relentless, even her critics fell silent. Every obstacle seemed a reminder of who she was and whom she represented. She was the daughter of people who had crossed oceans for a sliver of hope. She was the niece of a man who had stolen everything in the name of family. She was a product of both wound and willpower. There were nights Jane cried in her tiny dorm room, overwhelmed by the complexity of the law and the prospect of actually facing Thomas in court one day. "It's too much," she admitted in her journal. "I don't even know if the truth is enough to win." But each time she considered giving up, she remembered her parents' silent suffering, their battered pride as the creditors swept away their life's work. That pain became her fuel. Bit by bit, Jane built her foundation. She sought out mentors, Asian American professors, who shared stories of their own battles in the legal world, upperclassmen who had interned at firms in the city and who offered advice about study habits, mock trials, and the politics of the courtroom. She joined the Asian Law Student Association, where she found young people sharing her hunger for justice and her struggle with belonging. Jane's worldview expanded as she realized her family's ordeal was painfully common. She heard stories of immigrant families locked in legal struggles, over wages stolen by employers, businesses ruined by prejudice, homes taken by exploitation. For every tearful story, Jane's resolve hardened. She absorbed legal terminology the way she had once learned multiplication tables at the kitchen table with her father. She practiced her arguments alone each night, imagining herself not as a frightened outsider, but as a champion for her family and everyone whose voices had been buried by shame or fear. When the first year ended, Jane visited home for summer break, a changed person. She stood taller, her eyes steadier. She brought home a stack of casebooks and scribbled notes. She shared, gently but firmly, the ways the legal process might be used to reclaim what their family had lost. Her parents listened, hesitant, but moved by the clarity and devotion in their daughter's voice. The seed of trust, shaky but vital, was finally planted. As the sun set one evening, Jane sat next to her father on the porch. "I know this scares you, Dad," she said softly,
We both know
"but I can't let what happened to us be our ending. I want to fight, not just for us, but because I have to believe people like us deserve more." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of pride, sorrow, and hope. He nodded, a gesture small but sincere. The victory was incomplete, but it was real. Jane had claimed her path, not out of rebellion, but necessity. The road ahead would be long and full of risk, but her decision was unmovable. The old life, full of comforting habits, quiet joys, unspoken sacrifice, was gone. In its place stood a young woman armed with purpose and a fierce yearning for justice. With every lesson, every sleepless night, Jane was no longer simply a victim of her uncle's betrayal. She was becoming the architect of her family's new destiny. determined to change the fate that others had chosen for them. The first confrontation summer in Washington carried an odd mix of cool gray and humid brightness, as if the sun was struggling to burn through remnants of cloud. Jane returned home for break, carrying more than just heavy textbooks. A year's worth of transformation clung to her, both armor and wound. Her family's house, though smaller now after downsizing, remained a fragile haven. She felt her own strength, but sensed the ache in her parents' silences, the way Daniel's hands trembled ever so slightly over the evening paper. One Sunday afternoon, as Jane was helping her mother knead dough for dumplings in the kitchen, the phone rang with an unfamiliar, clipped insistence. Linda answered. Jane only caught snippets. Yes, long time. Next weekend? All together? Her mother's eyes darted in Jane's direction with uncertainty. After she hung up, Linda quietly announced that Jane's uncle, Thomas, was inviting the entire family for a get-together. The intention, on its face, was innocent. A gathering for old times' sake, a chance to connect after hardship. Daniel's reaction was immediate and visible. Color drained from his face. "We haven't seen him in years," he said, his words wooden. What could he possibly want now? Jane's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to appear neutral. Inside, her mind whirred, cataloging the possibilities. Was this an attempt at reconciliation, a show of familial face, or just another cruel twist? Either way, she knew this was the opening she needed. The first chance to see Thomas under her new light, as suspect, not family. The following Saturday, Jane dressed with careful deliberation. She wore a simple dress and tucked a small leather-bound notebook into her bag, along with a recording pen, just in case. As they drove through the streets toward her uncle's larger, more ostentatious house across town, each mile seemed to add weight upon weight. Daniel drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were nearly white. When they arrived, Thomas greeted them at the door with practiced warmth. His hair was slicked back, his smile wide, his movements brisk and confident. His own wife and children, her cousins, hovered in the background, engaged in small talk and the distracted laughter of people who sense drama, but pretend it isn't there. It was, to outside eyes, a perfectly normal family reunion. Trays of food lined the long kitchen island, ranging from spring rolls to apple pie. Thomas led the conversation, reminiscing about childhood memories, the old days at the shop, telling stories that danced across the past but skipped all the tender, wounded places. Jane observed him carefully, noting every shift in tone and glance. The way he avoided locking eyes with Daniel, a man once his closest confidant, was unmistakable. She saw, in the curve of her uncle's smile, a kind of practiced ease, as if he had lived so long with his own decisions that he no longer doubted himself. Jane wondered if guilt had ever kept him awake at night. Midway, through the meal, Jane excused herself and wandered into the study. Awards and photographs filled the space. On the mahogany desk sat a stack of business magazines, and, more interestingly, a folder stamped with the name of their old textile firm. Resistance burned in Jane's chest. She snapped a quick photo of the folder on her phone and memorized the legal firm's logo at the bottom of a letter peeking out. Every document, every little clue, might someday matter. She returned to the dining room just as Thomas was pouring tea and regaling the family with a self-deprecating story about a business meeting gone wrong. When Jane caught his gaze, she smiled serenely, her own expression unreadable. "Uncle Thomas," she spoke gently, but with deliberate clarity. "I've been taking a pre-law seminar at college. It's funny how different business law is from what people think. There are so many opportunities for misunderstanding, don't you think?" The conversation stilled, just for a heartbeat. Thomas's eyes flickered,
It's in.
calculating, then dismissive. "The law can be a mess," he replied evenly. "That's why families should always stick together. You know that, Jane." Her father shifted uncomfortably, but Jane pressed on. "Sometimes, though, even family has to face the consequences of their choices." There was an edge in her tone, softer than accusation, but sharper than idle chatter. A silence followed, brief but heavy. Linda cleared her throat, steering the conversation elsewhere. But Jane had seen what she wanted. The flash of unease that briefly darted across her uncle's otherwise smooth features. The rest of the meal unfurled with a tense politeness, each topic picked with care, as if they were all walking a tightrope above old wounds. When dinner finished and dishes were stacked high, Thomas invited Jane out to the backyard under pretense of needing help with the grill. Alone beneath the tangled grapevines, he spoke first, his tone controlled. "You have grown. Smarter, I see, and more suspicious." Jane met his gaze steadily. "I learned from the best, or maybe the worst. Depends on who's telling the story." Thomas leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't waste your energy chasing phantoms, Jane. Some things can't be undone, only lived with. Your family has always struggled with adaptation. Learn to let it go." His words dripped with condescension, yet unmasked a sliver of threat. Jane allowed herself a small, tight smile. "It's not in my nature to let things go, especially when the truth is at stake." For a moment, their eyes locked, an unspoken war of wills passing between them. Jane felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to lash out, to call him a liar, a thief, to show him the evidence she already held. But she knew she had to be patient. Law, she'd learned, was a game of strategy as much as evidence. Instead, she said, "You're right. Some things can't be changed, but they can be exposed, and they will be." With that, she turned and walked away, her legs shaking, but her mind clear. In the shadows behind her, Thomas watched for a moment before rejoining the others, his mask of affability firmly back in place. The drive home was silent, save for the hum of tires on the road and Linda's quiet breathing. Daniel kept his eyes fixed ahead. Jane gazed out the window, knowing that the confrontation had set something irreversible into motion. The questions would come, most of them silent, but she was ready for them now. That night, Jane jotted in her notebook, "He knows I know. The game has started."
Oh no!
She scrolled through the covert photos on her phone, scanning every detail for patterns, signatures, anything that might eventually be evidence in court. She mapped out potential allies and opponents, legal clinics, advocacy groups, professors who specialized in business fraud. Her mind whirred with possibilities. There was still so much to learn, still more risk than certainty. But the mask had slipped, however briefly. For the first time, Jane felt certain that the path she'd chosen was not only just, but necessary. The first confrontation had ended, but the battle for her family's justice had only just begun. Seeking allies. In the days that followed the fraught family gathering at her uncle's home, Jane's thoughts churned with anxious purpose. The mask had come off, if only for a moment, and she knew now, beyond any trace of doubt, that Thomas understood she was not the intimidated niece he remembered. With this silent battle line drawn, Jane realized she could no longer shoulder the coming fight alone. If she wanted any chance against her uncle's cunning and connections, she would need allies. That summer, Jane's world expanded in urgent and unpredictable ways. Her days took on a new discipline. Some mornings, she would wake before sunrise, nerves thrumming, her mind crowded with strategies and questions she hadn't even known to ask a year ago. Over coffee in the quiet kitchen, She would methodically type out what she hoped were professional-sounding emails. She contacted law clinics at neighboring universities, described her family's plight, sometimes in stilted, halting English, always with more humility than pride, and waited anxiously for replies. The process was humbling and sometimes humiliating. A few inquiries went ignored, some met with terse rejections. But little by little, doors opened. A professor from the University of Washington's law school replied with careful encouragement, suggesting resources and the importance of documenting every detail: timelines, correspondence, financial statements. An Asian American legal advocacy organization offered a preliminary consultation. Their staff attorney, Mrs. Tran, greeted Jane on video call with a patient smile and a gentle accent, not unlike Linda's. Jane prepared for that meeting with legal pads filled with notes, receipts, and scanned documents. As Mrs. Tran listened, her face grew solemn. "You've done difficult work already," Mrs. Tran said, "but a case as complex as this, especially with family betrayal, requires patience, meticulous evidence, and above all, support. You're not alone, Jane. Many of us came from families that thought the law was a luxury or a curse, but justice has to start somewhere." Through Mrs. Tran, Jane was introduced to a small circle of law students and volunteer attorneys who specialized in pro bono work for immigrants and small business owners. They arranged regular calls. There were weekends spent at community workshops in noisy civic halls, translators bustling about, tables strewn with leaflets about housing rights and legal clinics. For the first time, Jane stood up before strangers and told her family's story, her voice trembling but resolute, in both English and halting Vietnamese. The network she built was different from what she'd known in college. Here, no one cared about shiny resumes or perfect diction. One woman in the group worked nights cleaning offices and took classes on labor law in the afternoons. Another man, also a first-generation student, had lost his family's business in a contract scam eerily similar to Jane's. There was a silent camaraderie in their shared anger, their stubborn optimism. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, Jane felt witnessed. Her pain wasn't being pitied, but understood. As her web of contacts grew, it became clear that a legal battle with Thomas wouldn't just be a personal reckoning, but also a long campaign waged through documents, deadlines, and institutional barriers. Jane practiced with Mrs. Tran's team, role-playing depositions and cross-examinations, learning how to keep her emotions in check. She studied examples of cases won and lost, not just by facts, but by tenacity and clarity. At home, Jane's new confidence was slowly infectious. Daniel still carried shame in every step. He rarely left the house alone, and the neighbors' curious glances never seemed to soften. But he started to look Jane in the eye as they spoke. The night Jane cautiously shared that she had found an attorney willing to review their documents, Daniel nodded grimly, his voice low. Maybe you can do what I could not. Don't let him take any more from us." Linda rallied in quieter ways. She began to attend meetings at church and the local temple again, sometimes standing up for the Nguyen name when gossip swirled. Small acts, a gentle touch on Jane's shoulder, bringing her fruit and tea late at night, spoke of growing faith in her daughter's cause, even if fear still shadowed her smile. The strain of illness lingered, but Jane's mother let hope anchor her for the first time in months. Through community connections, Jane learned about others who had fought similar injustices. There were stories of restaurant owners whose partners had absconded with life savings, of home care workers denied wages, of grocery stores shuttered over missing paperwork that was never really missing at all. Jane began to collect their stories, finding patterns, ways that language and trust had been weaponized against the vulnerable. She asked questions, took notes, and, on occasion, offered comfort and advice herself. Allies came from unexpected places. An old teacher from high school, Mr. Chandler, who had always quietly encouraged Jane's analytical mind, wrote a heartfelt recommendation that bolstered her credibility with the legal clinic. One of her cousins, previously aloof, cautiously messaged her through social media with words of support and stories of noticing oddities in Thomas's business practices that now made chilling sense. Even Daniel's old friend from the textile days showed up at the house with a battered folder of business records, his loyalty unwavering. But having allies also meant new pressures. Jane quickly learned that trust was a process, not a guarantee. Mrs. Tran warned her that settlement offers might come her way, tempting the family with just enough money or face-saving promises to avoid trial. "You have to decide what justice means for you," she cautioned. "Is it the money, the truth, or simply the chance to tell your story publicly and be believed?" Jane lost sleep, wrestling with these questions. Knowing her parents' pride could sway either way, the process demanded even more of Jane's time, and the balancing act was grueling. There were nights she dreamed in legal terms: burden of proof, statute of limitations, deposition. Days passed in a blur of emails, notaries, and translations. Some nights ended with her head in her arms, overwhelmed and on the verge of despair, but always she forced herself to stand back up. Each small victory, a document certified, a witness located, became new kindling for her persistence. Through all of it, Jane realized the most vital allies were her own parents, gradually reforged not just as people she was saving, but as partners in the struggle. She coached Daniel on how to recount his memories for the lawyers. She confided in Linda about her doubts and fears, receiving, in return, not answers, but reassurances that Jane had never truly been alone. As summer's end crept closer, Jane looked at the web of people supporting her. Mentors, friends, a growing army of believers in the possibility of justice. For the first time since the collapse, the future felt less like a wall and more like a long, difficult, but traversable road. With her evidence compiled, her allies rallied, and her family at her side, Jane took a breath and prepared, at last, to bring her family's story out of shadow and into the unmapped light of the courtroom. On the threshold of justice. The first autumn rain tapped urgently against the windows of the Nguyen family's modest rental. Jane sat at the kitchen table, papers arrayed in tight stacks around her, each one representing hours of work, each a small piece of the collective anguish her family had suffered. Outside, the world seemed indifferent to her family's struggle, but for Jane, time felt suspended. Her days measured less by sunrise and sunset than by legal deadlines and the heavy beat of anticipation in her chest. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a war room. Jane had transformed the dining nook into her headquarters, folders overflowing with depositions, evidence logs, color-coded timelines, and printouts of legal statutes. Her laptop glowed deep into the night, often projecting Jane's tense face onto the drawn curtains as she practiced arguments, reviewed procedures, and triple-checked filings for the smallest of errors. The months of preparation had hardened Jane in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer the shy, obedient daughter who avoided conflict. She was a strategist, familiar with the language of motions, affidavits, and cross-examination. Still, the looming trial was more than an academic exercise. It was a crucible, threatening to consume the fragile hope she had rebuilt. Facing down, fear. Despite the hours spent with her growing network of legal advisors and community allies, an inexorable anxiety settled in Jane's bones. Fear came in different forms. The dread of public scrutiny, the whispered doubts of the Vietnamese community, the gnawing question, What if, even with the truth, the system failed them? Jane heard rumors at the temple and in the neighborhood that airing the family's dirty laundry would bring shame, that no real justice was possible for people like them, that the powerful always won. Sometimes, Daniel would beg Jane quietly in the hallway, "Are you ready for the cost? Even if the law is on your side, will they ever look at us the same?" But it was Linda's worry, quiet but constant, that tugged hardest at Jane. Her mother feared not just for their reputation, but for Jane herself, her future, her heart, her soul. Some nights, when exhaustion overtook Jane at her desk, she'd recall the long-ago simplicity of her parents' dreams, the warmth of pho simmering on a Sunday, the lull of her father's humming as he closed the factory late at night. She brought those memories into focus, letting them anchor her resolve. "This isn't about revenge," she reminded herself in scribbled notes. "It's about making our voices heard, no matter where it leads." The final countdown. As pre-trial meetings intensified, Jane became fluent in the cadence of the legal process. She navigated the maze of discovery with Mrs. Tran and the pro bono team, learning to scrutinize every response from Thomas's attorneys for hidden traps. Her uncle, who once felt invincible and distant, became more present, an adversary now, rather than a shadow. Every motion he filed to delay or obscure, and every snide comment relayed, through acquaintances, became further proof of the stakes involved. There were new threats, too. Jane received anonymous emails warning her to drop this foolish fight. Once, she saw a strange car idling on their street after midnight. While friends offered to keep watch, and Mrs. Tran urged Jane to keep a call log, the psychological warfare weighed heavily, fraying nerves that were already bare from months of work. At home, the pressures transformed her family. Her mother, still fragile from illness, meditated quietly during dawn hours, praying for peace, but also for strength. Daniel, having agreed to testify, rehearsed his memories until they sounded less like guilt and more like fact. Both parents did their best to support Jane, but the old warmth was subdued, waiting for permission to return. Building the case. Jane's days were spent assembling the narrative for court. She organized a chronology of betrayal, contracts forged, signatures faked, assets drained under her uncle's double dealing. She met with witnesses, former factory workers, clerks, even distant relatives, tirelessly pursued by Jane until they agreed to provide statements. Each fragment of testimony helped rebuild the story that Thomas had tried to erase. One poignant afternoon, Jane sat across from Daniel, recorder between them, as he spoke for the first time of his brother's manipulation. The shame was still there, but a new determination, mirrored in Jane, rose to the surface. "If you believe we still have a chance, Jane," he said quietly, "I will trust your way." Jane also spent hours with her fledgling legal team, mock cross-examining herself and her parents, preparing them for the intimidation tactics that Thomas's lawyers would attempt. Her stomach twisted at the prospect of being called a liar, of her family's motives being distorted to serve Thomas's defense. When Linda's hands shook as she described her husband's collapse, Jane reached across the table and steadied them, gently reminding her mother to breathe and focus on facts. The night before the trial, Jane slept little. She reviewed her notes by the window, rain tracing familiar paths down the glass. She thought of the children whose laughter no longer filled the old factory, the smell of cloth bolts once so full of promise, the unwritten future that had been stolen from them. She wrote a letter to herself, a promise to tell the truth, to hold her ground, and to leave the outcome in the hands of the court. For the first time in months, she felt a trembling sense of peace. Her parents joined her for a late meal, their conversation unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since before the collapse. They spoke about home, Vietnam, the journey across the sea, the stubborn hope that America wouldn't just be a place of struggle, but of belonging. For the first time, Linda clasped Jane's hands and said, "No matter what happens, Con, we are proud." Crossing. The threshold dawn broke quietly the next morning, golden light scattering over a city only half awake. Jane dressed carefully, choosing a suit that fit like borrowed confidence. She tucked a Lucky Charm, a weathered red envelope from her childhood, into her pocket, then checked on her parents. Together, they walked to the courthouse, side by side, as neighbors watched them with a mix of sympathy and suspicion. Outside the courthouse, Jane paused. The glass doors reflected her family, older and more fragile, but also still whole. She squared her shoulders, tempering her nerves with resolve. With every step inside, she felt less afraid. They were no longer just survivors of betrayal, standing alone and invisible. They were, at last, on the threshold of justice, determined, united, and ready to speak the truth. The battle in the courtroom. The courthouse loomed stark and impersonal, its concrete steps dusted with rain from the night before. Inside, fluorescent lights painted everything in a sterile glow. Jane's heart hammered with every step down the marble hallway, her breath shallow, her parents close behind her. She gripped the handle of her briefcase like a lifeline. Inside were months of work, evidence, notes, and hope. When they entered the courtroom, Jane's eyes swept over the unfamiliar landscape. The judge's towering bench, the jury's solemn seats, the opposing counsel's cold, professional faces. At one table, Thomas sat flanked by his lawyers, his posture as unyielding as ever, his eyes unreadable. They barely acknowledged Jane and her family, except with a perfunctory nod, as if this showdown were mere routine. Mrs. Tran and the small pro bono team arrived moments later, their presence grounding Jane. "Just remember, the truth doesn't have to be perfect," Mrs. Tran whispered, giving Jane's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "It only has to be real." The opening gambit. The trial began with a flurry of formalities, the bailiff's commands, the swearing in of the jury, the reading of motions. As Jane listened to Thomas's lead attorney deliver his opening statement, she felt both fury and anxiety. The lawyer spoke with calm confidence, painting Thomas as a fellow victim, an uncle stepping in to salvage a failing family business, only to be wrongly accused due to misunderstandings born of grief and desperation. Then it was Mrs. Tran's turn. Her words were simple and unwavering. She outlined the betrayal with clarity, how trust had been weaponized, how signatures were forged, assets siphoned, and a family left in ruins. Jane saw several jurors glance at her, some sympathetic, some skeptical. The judge's attention was sharp, taking notes, his poker face giving away nothing. The evidence unfolds.
All right, take your time.
Day by day, the case unfolded with tense, methodical precision. Evidence was introduced, each document painstakingly authenticated. Contracts bearing Daniel's forged signature, records of shell company, transfers, email correspondences from Thomas's private accounts. Jane's task was to help Mrs. Tran connect the paperwork with the lived trauma of her family. Together, they guided the jury along the timeline of exploitation. Witnesses took the stand. Former factory workers who recounted sudden changes in management, drastic pay cuts, and odd instructions from Thomas. Some had tears in their eyes as they described being let go. Others nervously avoided meeting Thomas's gaze. Daniel, stiff in a borrowed suit, recited the story of his faith in his younger brother, his hope for expansion, and the sudden collapse that left him sleepless for months. Each word seemed to cost him dearly. When Jane finally testified, her hands sweated on the witness stand. She described the painstaking investigation that began with nothing more than a strange letter, and a lingering doubt. She explained how she taught herself to read legal English, decode bank records, and conduct late-night research. Opposing counsel pressed with pointed questions, seeking to frame her as an emotional, vengeful child out of her depth. But Jane's voice, though shaken, remained steady. "I'm not just here for my parents," she told the judge quietly. "I'm here because I believe the truth matters, even when it costs you nearly everything." The crossfire cross-examinations were brutal. Thomas's lawyers suggested Daniel had misunderstood documents he never fully read, implied that Jane's evidence was simply the result of family bitterness. They even put Thomas on the stand, where he performed with calm sorrow. He spoke of sleepless nights, painted himself as the family's last hope, and twisted half-truths into plausible denials. Jane felt the sting of every accusation, every tactic meant to confuse or discredit. There were times in the bathroom between sessions that she sobbed quietly, exhausted and uncertain. But Mrs. Tran, mentors, and sympathetic volunteers checked in through rushed texts and small gestures. They supplied snacks, quick pep talks, and gentle reminders of why the fight was worth it. Moments of truth. As the trial wound on, it was sometimes hard to believe justice could prevail over the slick maneuvering of Thomas's legal team. But then came a turning point, when Daniel's old friend, the former shop accountant, was called as a last-minute witness. His records, forgotten in a battered filing cabinet, exposed key discrepancies between Thomas's claims and the financial reality. Under careful questioning, he confirmed the timeline of suspicious transactions and produced a crucial piece of evidence: an email from Thomas in which he referenced, "closing the accounts before my brother finds out." The atmosphere shifted palpably. The judge frowned. The jury took notes with renewed energy, and even Thomas's stoic exterior slipped for a fraction of a second. The price of justice. With closing arguments approaching, the Nguyen family felt the weight of the preceding weeks. Jane could see the toll on her mother, dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands. On her father, whose stiff posture hid wounds that would not heal easily. They had opened their lives to strangers' scrutiny, relived every shame and failure for public record. Mrs. Tran's final words were not theatrical, but they rang with honesty. "Justice," she said to the jury, "is rarely a clean or painless victory. My clients will not recover what was stolen from them so easily. But the law can restore dignity, and it can make the cost of betrayal plain. The Nguyens are here not out of vengeance, but because truth matters." Thomas's team insisted it was all an unfortunate misunderstanding, asking the jury to consider whether family disputes belonged in court. Jane watched their closing with a blend of anger and fatigue. She knew even now the odds were not guaranteed. Waiting for the verdict. The judge dismissed the court for deliberation. The Nguyens waited in a stuffy hallway, every hour stretching painfully. Jane tried to distract herself by reviewing documents pointlessly, by staring at dust motes in the sun. Her parents held hands, the first time in months Jane had seen them do so. At last, the judge returned. The jury filed in. In a voice that betrayed neither excitement nor grief, the foreperson read the verdict. Thomas was found liable for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and ordered to pay damages and return remaining assets wrongfully taken. Aftermath. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Thomas sat unmoving, eyes lowered, his lawyers hastily gathering their files. Jane's mother quietly wept. Her father seemed both lighter and infinitely older, as if a great burden had been lifted only to reveal another behind it. The Nguyen family had won, but at a steep price. Their reputation would take time to rebuild, and the wounds of betrayal would not close easily. Yet, in the eyes of the law, they had found validation. The fight for dignity was not finished. It never truly was. But for now, Jane and her family had reclaimed a piece of their story and stepped, finally, beyond the shadow of their loss. Mending wounds. In the weeks that followed the trial's end, the Nguyen family found themselves suspended in an unfamiliar quiet. The whirlwind of court filings, tense strategizing, and sleepless nights was behind them, replaced now by the slow, uncertain process of healing. The verdict, though a triumph, had not erased the pain. It had simply created space for the wounds to surface and finally begin to mend. At first, the atmosphere at home was strangely subdued. There were relief and gratitude, yes, but also exhaustion, bewilderment, and the persistent ache of loss. The phone no longer rang with demands or threats. Lawyers' emails tapered off. Yet, Jane often caught her father staring into his tea, eyes tracing paths into memory, while her mother moved through the house with careful steps, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile peace. Jane, too, felt adrift. For months, she had lived in a state of high alert, her mind always calculating, bracing for the next peril or setback. In Victory's aftermath, a heaviness lingered. She wondered if the world expected her family to celebrate, to simply move on. But wounds earned over years could not be salved in a handful of days. Rediscovering family. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home again.
It's funny how things
Linda,
turn out, isn't it?
now less burdened by shame or secrecy, returned to her community activities at church and temple, though some looks from neighbors still felt sharp.
Tell us everything.
At first, she would smile politely, her eyes clouded by uncertainty. But when a neighbor sidled over with cautious congratulations, Linda held her gaze and thanked her. Small, defiant victories that rebuilt her sense of self, one day at a time. Daniel struggled in different ways. He carried both guilt and dignity. Guilt for having let his brother into the business, for the pride that blinded him to trouble, for exposing his wife and daughter to so much pain. And yet, the trial had shown him he was not irreparably broken. At dinner, he tried, awkwardly at first, to resume nightly rituals, sharing a story from his youth in Vietnam, cracking a weak joke, asking Jane about her coursework. His laughter, when it came, sounded different than before, less carefree, more tender and deliberate. Jane noticed the change, but didn't rush the healing. She had learned, through hard experience, that true forgiveness could not be forced, nor grief hurried. Instead, she sought moments of connection, helping her mother plant late autumn bulbs in the tiny backyard, showing her father how to check email on his new phone. Sometimes, simply sitting together in companionable silence was enough. Internal healing. For Jane, recovery was as much an internal journey as a familial one. A sharp fatigue gripped her after the trial, the kind that no amount of sleep could touch. She wondered if the years of keeping secrets, fighting self-doubt, and acting as her family's conscience had aged her beyond her years. She threw herself into her studies again, but her focus shifted. No longer did she read legal case books solely from a place of hurt or retribution. Instead, she wanted to understand what healing could look like, not just for her family, but for others who had been betrayed by those closest to them. She joined mental health advocacy groups at her university. She attended workshops on trauma, restorative justice, and cross-cultural reconciliation.
So what happened that night, Mark?
In doing so, Jane discovered a vocabulary for her pain, and eventually, an ability to help others name theirs. Periodically, nightmares would wake Jane in the early morning hours. The echo of Thomas's lawyer's voice, the sting of cross-examination. Some wounds would never quite close. She learned to make space for these moments, writing in her journal, seeking counsel from mentors, and practicing the self-compassion she once gave only to her parents. The edge of forgiveness. One clouded afternoon, Jane's phone vibrated with a message from one of her cousins, Thomas's daughter. It was cautious, the tone uncertain. I heard about everything. I'm sorry for what my dad did. I hope someday things will be better between our families. It was just a handful of words, but they echoed in Jane's mind for days. She didn't know what to say, not at first. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't mean forgetting or excusing. It meant choosing not to let the past poison the future. She replied, "Thank you for reaching out. We're all hurting, in our own ways. Maybe one day, things will be different." It was the beginning of a conversation, painful, halting, but perhaps, eventually, redemptive. Community and acceptance. As autumn deepened, the Nguyens were invited to a community meal at their old temple. Jane hesitated, worried about gossip and side glances, but her mother insisted, "We belong there as much as anyone." To her surprise, support outnumbered suspicion. A few nodded curtly, but others welcomed them back with warmth, offering food, sharing stories, and acknowledging all they had endured. Jane realized that perseverance, not just suffering, commanded respect. Jane spoke quietly with other young people whose families bore invisible scars. Parents lost to addiction, grandparents who left in war, siblings estranged by pride or secrets. In those conversations, Jane sensed a universal longing for healing, for acknowledgement, for forgiveness, not just from others, but from themselves. Peace, not perfection. One evening, Jane and her parents gathered in the small living room, a pot of tea warming the space. Daniel cleared his throat, and for the first time he said, "I blame myself for so long I forgot how to hope, but all of us, we are still here. That has to mean something." Linda squeezed his hand and added, "We cannot change the past, but we can live fully now, for ourselves, for each other." Jane nodded, feeling the sharpness of old pain slowly replaced by something softer. "We have scars," she said, "but maybe scars show we survived. Maybe they're just where new strength grows." As the first snow dusted the rooftop, Jane sat at her bedroom window, notebook open. She wrote, "Justice gave us back our truth. Now healing begins, slow, unfinished, but real." For the first time in a long time, she believed it. The road was still long, the wounds not quite closed, but the Nguyens' hearts and home were whole enough to begin dreaming again. This time, with eyes open and hope rebuilt not on naivete, but on the hard-won wisdom of survival and forgiveness. New beginnings. Spring arrived in Seattle in gentle waves, soft rain falling on cherry blossoms, the city reawakening as if from a long bruised sleep. For the Nguyens, the changing season mirrored a new chapter in their lives, one neither defined by loss nor the relentless struggle for justice, but by steady, cautious renewal. In the months after their legal victory, the family's wounds slowly scabbed over. Old routines returned, yet everything felt subtly transformed. Life hummed with a quiet hopefulness. Daniel woke early each morning to brew coffee in the sunlit kitchen, sometimes humming a forgotten melody from his childhood. Linda clipped basil in the backyard herb pots, her laughter, once rare, now slipping more freely from her lips as she traded recipes with neighbors over the fence. Jane herself straddled two worlds, daughter, caretaker, and now, in the eyes of her community and her own heart, an agent for change. During her final semesters in law school, her life was a blur of casebooks, exam deadlines, and internships. Yet, her purpose was clearer than ever. No longer did she study the law out of necessity or anger.
Be careful, please.
Now, she longed to unlock its power for those who, like her family, had once believed its doors forever closed.
You'll bet, sir.
Graduation, full circle. The day of Jane's law
This
school
is quite an old
graduation
piece,
was
made of
cloudless and
sterling
bright.
silver,
Her
likely
parents
from the
sat in the
late
crowded
19th or
auditorium,
early 20th
Daniel in
century.
his best jacket, Linda wiping tears from beneath her glasses as Jane crossed the stage to receive her diploma. The applause echoed like an answer to every silent prayer, every late-night whisper, every moment when hope had seemed impossible.
You have it?
Jane's mind
Here,
flashed with
take it.
memories. Her father teaching her to balance the books at the kitchen table, her mother smoothing her hair before school interviews, the days and nights bent over legal texts, pushing through doubt. She thought of the trial, her hands shaking as she testified, the verdict, her family huddled together in that wood-paneled courtroom. Today, the shadows finally lifted. In the parking lot after the ceremony, Jane's family took photos by a blooming dogwood tree. "You always wanted to see us safe in America, Dad," Jane said quietly, hugging Daniel tightly. "We made it." Daniel shook his head, smiling through tears. "No, Con, you made it possible for all of us."
We need to move fast.
Seeds
This is our
of
window
renewal.
opportunity, so
With
let's
her
make it
degree, Jane secured a position at an immigrant rights nonprofit in Seattle. She became both advocate and translator, guiding families caught in complex legal webs, holding parents' hands while they recounted betrayals and
Police are
injustices,
coming, Robert.
reassuring college-aged daughters sitting where she had once sat. Often, she found herself facing rooms filled with stories that echoed her own, and each time she listened, she felt her own healing deepen. Her commitment extended beyond her formal job. Jane volunteered at pro bono legal clinics, led workshops
is
on
where she
financial
attempted to burn the
literacy and
letters.
contract basics for the Vietnamese community, and, in quieter moments, mentored students struggling to find their voices in academic and legal spaces. Her efforts earned her the trust and admiration of elders and peers alike. But more than recognition, Jane valued the small victories. The thanks of a grandmother who reclaimed her home. The relief in a young man's eyes when his work hours were finally
I noticed
compensated.
it too.
A
noticed
changed
it too.
family. Back at home,
evidence
the
against
victories
you
and
is
scars
quite
of the past
substantial,
shaped,
Hannah.
rather than dictated, the family's dynamic. Daniel, once weighed down by guilt and shame, found purpose again volunteering at a local job skills program, teaching new immigrants how to navigate paperwork, credit, and small business basics. His empathy, sharpened by loss and redemption,
Please, you have to
made him a
believe me.
patient guide.
I'm doing everything
Linda's
I can,
health
Robert.
continued to improve, her spirit emboldened by the ordeal she had survived. She started a community
Thank
garden
you.
plot with other women from the
Thank you.
temple, harvesting herbs and vegetables that she distributed to families in need. Her quiet strength became an anchor, not just for her own household, but for neighbors who sought her counsel. The three Nguyens, once set adrift by betrayal, rediscovered the little rituals that spoke of trust. Sunday dinners with laughter, evening walks in the golden hush before dusk, the gentle act of tending houseplants together. Arguments, when they came, were met with honesty and even humor,
This evidence
a
ties
mark of
everything
scars
together.
healed enough to endure sunlight. Looking ahead, together. One June evening, as
This case
twilight
is about
blurred the city
justice,
into lilac and
about
indigo,
responsibility,
Jane and her parents
about the
sat
truth.
together on the back porch, sipping hot tea. The air was fragrant with cut grass and distant honeysuckle. Daniel broke the comfortable silence. "We risked so much for this new life. Sometimes I wonder, do you ever regret pushing back, Jane? Going to court? All that pain?" Jane set her cup down. "No, because it gave us back ourselves. And it showed me that justice isn't about getting even. It's about not letting fear decide our story. We're more than what happened to us." Linda nodded, reaching for her daughter's hand. "Your courage became ours. Each step you took brought us farther from the darkness." Around them, the garden vibrated with the quiet persistence of life. Fireflies hovered, undaunted by the weight of the past. Jane gazed at her parents. Older, yes, but mended and proud. "We can't promise the world justice," she whispered, "but we can keep planting it, one choice at a time." New roots. That autumn, Jane was invited to speak at her old high school. Her speech wasn't dramatic. She spoke plainly of struggle and doubt, of how family wounds can cast long shadows, and how asking for help is itself an act of courage. Afterward, a shy girl approached her, tears in her eyes, and said, "Hearing you made me feel like I'm not alone." Jane realized that even now, the ripple of her family's journey was reaching further than she could have imagined. The Nguyens' address changed again as they purchased a modest new home, a testament to the stability and autonomy they'd fought so long to reclaim. On the day
Check the
they
last
moved
known
in,
coordinates again.
Linda placed a small statue of a carp by the door. She told Jane, "The carp swims upstream. It becomes a dragon, but it never forgets the river." The journey continues. For Jane and her family, new beginnings were not about leaving the past behind, but integrating its lessons into gentler, stronger lives. There would always be challenges, old hurts resurfacing, moments when the world seemed too much. But now, they met them not in isolation, but as a unit, wiser, braver, and finally free to look forward. One winter night, as snow spun softly outside her new bedroom window, Jane wrote in her journal. And so, beneath the roof of their new home, the Nguyens began, imperfect, resilient, and full of hope, again.